Today we have the opportunity to visit the V&A Wedgwood collection in Barlaston in Staffordshire. You used to be able to get there by train, but unfortunately the station closed in the early 2000s, so you can now get the number 100 bus, which is included with a free ticket or as part of a rail fare. You can now also park there. There's quite a large parking lot. It's not a very heavily visited museum, and a lot of people probably haven't heard of it. Wedgwood was a very innovative and key scientific thinker ahead of his time. He experimented a lot, as we'll see, and he drove innovation in the pottery industry, turning the Staffordshire potteries from a small earthenware manufacturer to a real powerhouse of the industrial world, dominating porcelain across Europe and America. Outside you can see a statue. It's actually a replica of the statue of him outside Stoke Station. The entrance is into this large atrium with a portrait of Josiah Wedgwood made from Wedgwood plates. To the right there's a very large shop. Upstairs there's a factory tour, and you can walk down this very pink tunnel towards the V&A's collection. This museum actually used to be the Wedgwood Visitors Centre for probably about 30 years, and then it evolved with a large grant and the introduction of involvement with the Victoria and Albert Museum into this large and very detailed history of the life of Wedgwood. And really, he was a very significant figure and one of the great artists of his time. So I think it does a very good job of telling Josiah Wedgwood's story, as well as the company Wedgwood, because it did continue after his death and it continued to innovate for a very long time. So we enter into this gallery with some examples. There's his famous medallion on the background there, which was anti-slavery. He was a key proponent of abolishing slavery, and he helped to fund a lot of those efforts by selling cameos and artworks and plates. There's some interesting vases here, because the other big thing he was famous for was the Portmeirion vase, which we'll see in a little while. This room holds a eclectic collection of small items from probably the last century, from the Apollo moon landings commemoration, royal commemorations, a lot of different plates and pots and pottery items created by Wedgwood. And through there you can see the Portland vase, which took about 5 years for Wedgwood to make a replica of this wonderful Roman vase, which is now, I believe, in the British Museum. As we move into the main gallery itself, this conical structure here is a replica of a pot kiln, and you can see videos of what would have been called saggers who were loading the pot kiln. It was actually a skill in itself, because you need to place the earthenware pots with the pottery inside, close it up, and having loaded them you need to balance the heat, so you need everything to fire at the same rate and it needs to be stacked properly. And your control was effectively, you burnt coal or wood to raise the temperature, and you had small samples of pottery that were designed to respond to different temperatures, so you had an idea of what temperature was, but none of the electrics and electronics of a modern kiln. It was all very much done by feel and knowledge. And there we see some saggers that pots would actually have been stored in. And the whole kiln would have been filled. There were thousands of pot kilns in Stoke up till probably 60 or 70 years ago. And this section tells the history of Josiah Wedgwood and the potteries. When he came along, Stoke has a lot of clay, so that area has a very thick, firm clay, and it was used for earthenware, rough, everyday, very good for jugs and mugs and even teapots. You could see that there was a level of detail and artistry in the way that the different types of clay were composed to form colours and patterns. And certainly in terms of shape, on the right you've got more thrown items. If you look at the teapot on the left, it's definitely a pressed item where it's moulded in place, and then the parts were put together, probably the spout, the body and the lid and the handle. But it very quickly evolved to more detailed, and as the moulding improved and the glazing improved, Wedgwood introduced, or certainly popularised, the green and white pattern there, the cauliflower pattern, where taking advantage of the glazes, there was an almost majolica-like process to create a more artistic, everyday, sturdy ware. And then that evolved into the cream wares as there was an improved glaze, improved use of the actual clay itself. But you can't see through it. It's not translucent in the way that a modern Wedgwood plate would be. If you buy a piece of Wedgwood, it's almost certainly fine bone china. And that's actually inspired by the Chinese pottery, which was considered far superior to Western pottery right up until 1740s, 50s. And it was aspired to, and Wedgwood looked at that and he wanted to challenge, and he wanted to create porcelain. He wanted to reach the same standard that the Chinese had been at for a long time. And you had similar processes in Dresden, in Germany, and Limoges in France, where pottery became more elegant, detailed, finer. I believe that's Wealden, his first business partner. There in the middle's Josiah Wedgwood and his wife, Sarah. At this time, every pottery works would have had a single pot kiln, and one of the first things he did when he set up his Etruria works was have multiple pot kilns. Because if a kiln takes 3 days to load, 2 days to fire, a day to unload, you're effectively limited to one loading a week, one burn a week. And what he was able to do was stagger that and create a more, what we'd consider today, a factory process. Now returning to the creamwares, you can see here, again, the creamwares have moved forward. There's more detail, there's more decoration, there's more fineness to it. There's chinoiserie in the teapot on the top right there, but if you look down at the plate on that soup tureen there, or the bowl up at the top, where all of the little pieces cut out, it's a higher form of pottery. It's much more evolved, less naive, and considering that had happened within really 10 or 15 years, it's a very substantial change in the industry. And Wedgwood was at that time where the industry was expanding and things were happening very quickly, but certainly his scientific efforts were key in that. And from very early days, he also did custom commissions where you could make a commission with a pattern to match your specific requirements. The brown one there is actually like a wooden mould that then clay was put on and then formed a mould. They then made a mould that they could pour liquid clay into so that they could mould very fine details. And here these are actually, I think, railings from the Etruria works. There's very little left of the Etruria works. It was next to the canal. It was very key in moving him massively upscale in terms of his production, but it in the end wasn't large enough, and they moved out of Stoke itself and set up the Barlaston works here. And it's a very large estate. In the middle of that estate is now the Wedgwood Visitors Centre, the factory, although I don't think it's unfair to say not much Wedgwood is made in the UK these days. And there's parkland you can walk around. There's some new housing estates. Here's a painting of his early work. It was still a very rural area. Here a commemorative plate with Enoch Wedgwood from 1876. This was one of the earlier names that Wedgwood was known by, and I think it existed through to the 1970s. Here is a model of the original works at Etruria, and you can see instead of just having one pot kiln, there's numerous pot kilns, as well as large design studios, manufacturing, and his own place on the canal. There's also a very old 1780s fire engine. So it was a wooden hand pump. Along with, here's a turning lathe. Much as you would turn wood, you could actually turn clay and also the moulds for it. So this vase here was turned on a machine much like the one on the right here. Allowed you to carve it with finer details and balance using those tools there, the little wheels. These plates, these are experimentation, so they didn't simply make creamware, they had hundreds of attempts, and each of the different combinations of pottery types, glazes, temperatures came out with a different result. And it could be a simple change from what you actually wanted to achieve with creamware through to a very burnt out, crispy, salty texture. And it was through experimentation that they achieved all of the changes that we've seen so far, and certainly further in. A brief explanation here of the models and moulds. They would carve a model like this wooden vases here. They would then be moulded, and the pottery would come out in the same shape but with the finer details. And also there was the potter's wheel, which originally there'd be a lady with a large wheel turning it in order to spin the lump of clay that was being thrown into a shape. Generally it's a circular shape like a vase or a bowl, and it could be created with a consistency. You can see a little blade at the bottom that's scraping the curve on the bottom, and you would just add slip and water, shape it with your hand and carve it off with a blade. And experimentation was at the heart of Wedgwood's work. You can see here mortars and pestles, various equipment for grinding, mixing, testing, and he undertook thousands and thousands of individual tests in order to achieve the right glazes, textures, use of pottery, and actually how to produce fine bone china. And part of the clue is in the bone. It's actually cow bones that are ground into a mix of clays to produce that translucence. Here you've got some interesting cameos, very much inspired by the Roman and Greek cameos. Wedgwood brought that back as a very fashionable 18th century with these Jasperwares, with the Jasperware base, and on that was put a very slim moulded white cameo. And here's actually a pen and some of the things that he actually worked with, and I believe this is the desk that he carried out his experiments on, along with a book where he kept quite detailed notes, and a clock from his house. Here's some of the examples of glazes he took. With Jasperware, it took a very long time to produce the difference between what's called a biscuit. So it's fired and it's glazed, but it's not slick to the hand, compared to the raised white pieces on Jasperware, which is much more in keeping with what you expect from a porcelain cup, or it's very smooth to the touch. And here's some examples of the wax moulding. Now this cabinet is a very small part of the collection of the tests that he undertook. He undertook tens of thousands of tests, and really all of his products and all of the evolution of pottery under his watch was due to experimentation. And there were plenty of people in Stoke-on-Trent. It was a hive of industry for the pottery, but I don't think anyone would argue that he drove the majority of that change. And although they've had key potters since, Wedgwood has never repeated that trick. Really, across British pottery, there's only been one Josiah Wedgwood. So the next section has a very interesting display of vases and candlesticks. It's hard to see on a camera, but it shows how much more detailed and fine, and it also shows very much the Chinese influence with the colouring on the vase, and the pheasant was a kind of British interpretation of Chinese or Chinese art, or chinoiserie as they called it back then, along with the Greek elements on that, where it was a very modern take on ancient Greece, a sort of 18th century ancient Greece. And there with the bamboo on those. Beautiful example. Here a marbled look. You can see again, it might not be to everyone's taste, so I wouldn't want it in my house, but you can see there's much more to that vase than, say, at the beginning of his career, where there was a shaped vase or there was a thrown vase, but it just didn't have the level of detail that it looked like marble. It was a mixed pattern. And here these black basalt wares, so almost back to basics. So again, very Greek inspired. You can see the vase in the background is a direct Greek inspiration, whereas the teapot at the front, the pattern is very much ancient Greek inspired. There's a crispness and a cleanness that vase really could have been made 5 years ago, not 250 years ago. Now even a bust of a Greek philosopher. And then we get into the beauty of Jasperware at its best. This, although it's just a Jasperware vase and a frieze, I would say you would struggle to find a piece of Wedgwood as fine as those vases today, because you would struggle to buy someone who could and would pay for it. You can see beautiful examples there of the blue, the green and the pink Jasperware. And really the underlying concept and delivery is unchanged in 250 years. And here one of Wedgwood's famous works, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? It's an iconic anti-slavery image, which he exploited and used heavily, as he was a very strong supporter of abolition. He believed it was morally wrong, and he was quite a religious man, and he did his best to fund and support in any way. Here's an original and very famous painting by Stubbs of Wedgwood's family. And it was quite a large family. And probably the most famous member of that family was Charles Darwin, his grandson. In fact, Charles Darwin and his wife were grandchildren of Josiah Wedgwood. Here are some examples from the Jasperware of the white slips of horses, when horses were very popular as an artistic design. There's always a period in which they're passing phases of art, and Jasperware's changed in that sense. I mean, look at this beautiful example here of overlapping and semi-transparent almost figures on the Jasperware. The beautiful cameos. It really has been used in pretty much way you can imagine. I once had the opportunity to visit IBM's office in Winchester, and have I think it was a dining room where it was plain walls, very heavily decorated walls and ceilings with Jasperware cameos and insets from Wedgwood. Here, these teapots. These are probably wall mounted. And obviously jewellery for the person. And some interesting Greek inspired vases. Here's some chess pieces, I believe. There's a beautiful chess set later on. Here it is. Not very cheap. This room's a recreation of one of the rooms in his house. And certainly the upper class considered Wedgwood a byword for quality all the way through the Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, and really only it's been with the decline of the use of much pottery in the last 20 or 30 years that you've seen Wedgwood's name used less often. I love this room. It's a very circular room, and each of the alcoves has a bust of a Greek or Roman god or important character. And up, if I look up, you can see this beautiful, almost Jasperware inspired domed ceiling. Then on to the Portland vase. Portland vase was owned by a lord, and when his property was all sold off, Wedgwood managed to negotiate getting to borrow the vase for a few years. I think he had it for 2 or 3 years, and it became an obsession for him. It became the pinnacle of his art that this vase that was 2,000 years old, he wanted to recreate it in its perfection. He saw it as a work of art superior to anything that could be made in its day. And it was made out of glass. He wanted to replicate it in pottery. And it took several years to work out the process of getting the base vase, getting the white figures on top, the correct translucence, the balance, and that when they were put together and fired, they didn't melt into each other or under fire, over fire. There used to be quite a collection of the messed up examples of where it went wrong. But there you can see the beauty of it's a perfect replica in pottery of the Portland vase. It is beautiful. The technical detail is very hard to underestimate, but it elevated and marketed Wedgwood. Although there's a lot of other examples of Wedgwood's work on display here, it really, for me, is the pinnacle of his work. And the other piece that's missing is the frog service, which until recently was kind of pushed quite a bit by Wedgwood in their exhibitions because it was still on sale. You could actually buy replicas that were hand painted in Barlaston to exactly match the service that was built specifically for Catherine the Great. And obviously, being Catherine the Great, this wasn't a service with 6 plates and 6 bowls. In fact, it had place settings for 50 people with 944 pieces of pottery, 680 for the dinner service and 264 for the dessert service, and each one was hand painted showing British scenes copied from plates. So it really was a masterpiece and a very major commission for Wedgwood back in 1774. Here, interesting collection of different plates and services here. Fair to say that in the 20th century, Wedgwood settled into a pattern of it had a style, it had a set. They have their dinner services, they have their Jasperware, and they reflect the tastes of the era. It's quite a barometer of the era what Wedgwood looks like, in that you could see the Greco-Roman influences at times, the Egyptian influences, as almost canopic jar at one place in the museum. You can see these little Greek vase almost, but they're actually ring pulls for, you know, if you want to switch off a light in the bathroom. And this area of the exhibition runs through a large selection of mainly 20th century Wedgwood. And you can still buy it at the shop on the way out. Don't worry, there's a large collection of Wedgwood for sale. Here's some early 20th century. Reminds me quite a bit, or the ones on the other side more so, of Royal Derby's Imari ware. Very heavily gilded, a lot of gold, a lot of colour, a lot of deep blues there, very much like an Imari. Well, I'm sure someone watching this would disagree with me. It's also a thematically displayed area where there's sort of kitchenwares, tablewares, rather than by the actual era. I mean, if you look at those plates there, you can see the golden brown fruit at the top, the blue wares in the middle. Very much different eras. And there again at the base, of very simpler, less, probably later. And then moving on here, definitely later, those. Some examples of teapots, some examples of cooking wares. And some beautiful jelly molds over here used for moulding jellies and pâtés. The milk and butter serving in there. Here's the molds. And you can still buy molds like that. You see, before you had silicone and plastic or metal jelly molds, people would buy very expensive Wedgwood ones made in earthenware. There's quite an extensive display of Wedgwood. Obviously, this being the Wedgwood Company's collection, which has now been curated by the V&A, but largely it's the same content. It's not hugely changed from when it was the Wedgwood Visitor Centre back in the 1990s. It's the same collection of pots. A little bit of the more modern ones are slightly changed, but largely it's the same collection. I think it's fair to say V&A bought kudos rather than content. And I will be doing a video on the Victoria and Albert Museum in London soon. That's probably my favourite London museum. And the V&A does have museums around the country, but largely centred on London. I think it's fair to say that there's possibly a link here with Tristan Hunt, who he was the MP for Stoke-on-Trent for a brief while, and when the director of the V&A resigned, it was his dream job, and he stood down as an MP, moved back to London. I don't think he was a Staffordshire person, I might be wrong there, but he moved back and became a director of the V&A. And it was around that time that there was a big investment and a reimagining of the Wedgwood Visitor Centre. And it's very much in the reimagining. It looks very different, but the content really is the same. If you like Wedgwood or respect Josiah Wedgwood's work, well worth a visit if you're nearby, but not so easy to get to if you're not. This section really highlights the commemoratives and specials. The statue there of the man leaning over the calipers, I believe that's actually a copy of the one outside the British Library. And here, very shiny Lusterwares. Probably not to modern taste. Or maybe that's just not to mine. I like to look at it. I wouldn't want it in my house. Yeah, some beautiful silver luster there on those tiny, dainty little teapots. An interesting collection of animals. What a first half of the 20th century. You're not going to look at every item in the museum, but I'd say you probably want to allow a couple of hours to really have a good look around. These interesting plates here, I think, linked to the exhibition. You can see at the top there, Churchill's bust. Beautiful vase here. We briefly see Josiah Wedgwood, the grandson of the original Josiah, who was, I think, the last Wedgwood to run the company and probably turned the business around a lot after some period of decline. And part of that turnaround was that he moved Wedgwood to Barlaston, built the new factory, had a huge round design studio close to the factory that allowed light all the way around for the designers, very much like the Apple's head office now is at Cupertino. Here, beautiful examples of Wedgwood from the last century. There's not very much from this century. A lot probably changed with changing tastes. Wedgwood was, I don't know whether it was officially merged or sold to Waterford Wedgwood, but as part of that process, two companies that specialised in high quality products were brought together. But there's a lot of difference between Pottery and Crystal. I know an Irish friend once said to me, well, once that merger happened, the potters never understood the Crystal. And I think a lot of people in Stoke-on-Trent would say that the same goes the other way. But they've combined with a series of other companies like Royal Albert as well. Certainly a beautiful collection, very thorough, very detailed. Probably highlights for me though why it's very difficult to produce fine pottery of this standard today for a profit. The blue vase there in the middle was Championship Cup for golf, and this was a limited edition advent calendar, one of 3 produced. As I draw to a close, I'd say if you're passing on the M6 or you're an aficionado of Wedgwood, or you happen to live nearby, it's definitely a museum which is well worth a visit and part of the industrial heritage of the UK. And since I was visiting Stoke-on-Trent to go to the Wedgwood Museum, I thought, why not call in? And we'll show here as a little bonus. This is actually where Wedgwood's buried. It's almost forgotten in a corner of the churchyard, but if you can find a place to park in the centre of Stoke, or it's a fairly quick walk over from the railway station, there's a large minster which is open about twice a week. And in the graveyard, there's the arch of an earlier church. And just behind that is Josiah Wedgwood's grave. It's a very simple, plain grave, not really particularly marked, but it is a nice way to end the day, I think, at sunset. And I personally think he's a very interesting character who achieved a lot, studied and learnt a lot, pulled himself back by his britches, and turned around the pottery industry and elevated it to a much higher standard. And really his legacy is still being traded off to this day. Here it is between the railings. So hopefully you enjoyed that and you'll consider a visit to the Wedgwood World, or it's the World of Wedgwood, and the Victoria and Albert Museum Wedgwood collection. There's also a pretty good town museum up in Hanley, or the Gladstone Pottery Museum, but that's only open 5 months a year. In the meantime, please feel free to subscribe or check out some of the videos in the playlist on the left.